Next month we're going to be hearing from Terry Sears about identification of ferns and their allies, and the next month we'll be hearing from Dr. Schultz, who will be giving a presentation on environmental ethics, which I think will be really exciting and something kind of new that we haven't talked about before. So keep your eyes open for those. We also are working on developing a new website, so keep your eyes open for that as well. I'm excited to launch it and hope that it is a little bit easier to use and also a little bit easier to look at. And then finally, we spent quite a bit of time today at our meeting discussing our summer field trips and mini courses, and I think we've got some cool stuff on the docket for the summer, so we'll get excited for that. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Michael Burdash from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, where he is an environmental research scientist. He has been at the PCA for 14 years, has been responsible for developing wetland vegetation monitoring and assessment techniques and applying them in a variety of settings. In today's discussion, he's going to talk about the Rapid Floristic Quality Assessment, or FQA, which is a wetland quality monitoring and assessment approach designed for wetland professionals. And it's the primary indicator for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's wetland quality status and trend monitoring. And it's also it's going to provide a step-by-step overview of this process and also talk about up-and-coming projects that they're working on to learn more about how site establishment methods and long-term outcomes. So without further ado, thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Christine. That was a fantastic introduction. I feel more important. So yeah, I'm gonna have a fair amount of graphics up here, and I think some of them I just pulled like right out of my reports. So the lettering and stuff is kind of small. If you want to see better, you can get up front, but it's up to you. We're going to talk a little bit about Rapid Floristic Quality Assessment today. I'm sure a lot of you people have heard about it. Maybe you've been to some of the trainings. For those of you that have been to the trainings, not a whole lot new today, but you know, WPA asked if we could talk about this again, maybe pick up some new members and keep some conversation going. So we're really just going to do kind of some step-by-step overview of it, and then hopefully tie it in with some of the other work that we've been working on. Unfortunately, Carol Stroyne from Bowser was unable to make it today. She's dealing with a family emergency, but I'm just going to speak for a few minutes on an exciting project that they've started, which hopefully will be very relevant to most of you out there today. So, Rapid Floristic Quality Assessment. Well, you know, we always got to start off at the top, and if you work for the government, that means no net loss policy. So, remember everybody, no net loss policy is quantity and quality and biological diversity of wetlands. So, if we want to get to quality, we have to have some ways to try to measure that, right? And over the last several decades, a wide variety of wetland quality assessment approaches, techniques have been developed. Usually come in one of two flavors. There's the functional assessment. I always think of functional assessment as being like the goods and services that the wetland is providing us. That's like the flood retention and the nutrient storage and things like that. There's also condition assessment. And condition assessment is really, we're trying to measure the deviation of a wetland from its natural state in some way. And so that's what we're dealing with the floristic quality assessment. It's really a condition assessment approach. So everything we're going to be trying to tie into is trying to measure this deviation from some sort of natural state using the vegetation. I want to say too that I freely will take questions during the presentation. If I just end up talking for an hour straight, Dylan won't be smiling anymore. This is going to be sad. So if you got questions, yeah, just raise your hand or blurt it out. We'll talk about it as it goes. Try to keep this more like a class lecture instead of me just sitting and talking to you. So when we have a deviation of a wetland from its natural state, what causes that? Well, it's human impacts or stressors. And you know, the big ones on the list are hydrologic alterations. That's the changing timing of water. It's not just drainage, it could be inundation, it could be changing the timing of the water that the wetland receives. This can lead to changes. Also, we can get delivery of excess nutrient or sediment, other types of chemical pollution like road salts, increasing salinity in wetlands. Clearly there's physical alterations. That's your plowing of the wetland, or north logging, or driving your ATV through it. And then of course non-native species. Now non-native species are kind of an interesting one. It's kind of a response and a stressor, at least to me. A typical vegetation response for a wetland under the face of these other types of impacts is the increase in these non-native species. But I've also seen plenty of situations where there's literally nothing going on at the wetland, and it's full of reed canary grass or invasive cattail. Therefore, it, probably got in on its own on some sort of natural disturbance regime, kind of started taking over on its own. So invasive species is kind of both. It's a response to stress, but can also be a stressor in of itself. So back to assessment methods, we have these rapid assessment methods. So EPA, let's just back up a second. So rapid assessment methods, what are the hallmarks of those? First of all, they typically rely on some sort of very simple field observations that are typically qualitative or categorical in nature. If anybody's ever done like the MinRam, you'll get asked like a series of multiple choice questions, and you have to make a judgment call, based on what you see. That's pretty typical for these rapid assessment methods all over the country. And EPA has kind of classified these assessment methods on 3 levels. The rapid one usually is called a level 2. And basically, the whole idea here is that, you're gathering course level information. You can obtain that level of information pretty quickly, as opposed to really detailed surveys, which usually take a lot of time. So you're kind of sacrificing some accuracy for your ability to get it done. That's kind of what we're going at with these rapid assessment methods. Floristic quality assessment has been around for quite a long time, and typically it's thought of, hey, we got to have a really high quality vegetation survey to do this approach. And when you're talking high quality data, you're talking high level of expertise, and typically a lot of time. That comes in at that EPA level 3. So, what we're talking about today is how can we kind of adapt these 2 ideas, or simplify the FQA a little bit to kind of bring it down into this idea of being more like a RAM. So what is the floristic quality assessment? Who's heard of the floristic quality assessment? Everybody. So, somebody tell me what it is. What's the coefficient of conservatism? Anybody? So, Jason. You created these, man. Very helpful.
Essentially, is the number assigned to each species per region that you're working in that reflects the species affinity to either a broad range of habitats or a specific habitat.
Yeah, that's about it. So it's really this species fidelity to habitat. So we have, and it's put on a numerical score or rating of 0 to 10. So our examples up there, we got our box elder tree. We all know box elder. It's adapted for floodplain forests, so a high disturbance environment. So it puts out a ton of seed and grows fast, and lives hard and dies young. But it also pops up everywhere else, so it has little affinity to that kind of its prime habitat. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we have our small white lady slipper, which really only find in those intact, wet prairie environments. It really needs that narrow habitat, that narrow niche to exist. So it gets that high rating. It shows a high degree of conservatism. And so FQA is basically anything that takes plant data and applies these coefficients of conservatism in some sort of metric. You can calculate all kinds of stuff with this metric. And the beauty with it is that it's been found over and over again to be kind of the most responsive class of metrics to be a good indicator for wetland condition. Study after study shows it to be pretty much the strongest one out there. So in the upper Midwest, I mean, this floristic quality stuff started in the Chicago region in like the late 70s and kind of started taking off in the 90s. I think there were various pushes in Minnesota to get it going, but it never really got off the ground until the mid-aughts, I guess, and PCA got a wetland grant to get these C values put out for the wetland flora, and Jason Roosevelt and Scott Milburn worked on that with us. And so we were able to release that in 2007. There was all kinds of stuff in here, but the big money piece here is those C values for the wetland flora. Is about 1,200 species with all these ratings on it. But that was just the beginning, at least for me. And so, we have these numbers, and it's like, well, what can we do with it now? And it's like, we're faced with the issue of how can we develop this in a new and interesting way, and and also address kind of two common criticisms at the same time. One criticism over here is that it takes a high level of botanical expertise and the sampling effort to get that high quality veg data, as well as what do these results mean? I mean, you can take vegetation data and you can apply these numbers and calculate things. But to date, at least back then, nobody really ascribed much meaning to what those numbers might be telling you. So some work needed to be done with that. So our objectives were to develop a rapid wetland sampling protocol that's going to focus on the more common and easy to ID species, and as well as develop some data-driven assessment criteria to meet kind of those criticisms up there. And so in the end, our goal is to kind of create this rapid condition assessment method that's really targeted for hopefully a lot of folks in the room here. Wetland professionals that have sort of this moderate level of botanical expertise. I mean, like you've been working in the field for a couple of years. You're, at least for a few types that you go to, more of the common, easy to identify species. It's not necessarily meant for somebody straight out of school. Usually they have to have a little experience under their belt. So applications, what can we do with this? And I would say you can use it for anything as long as there's some sort of question that deals with, wetland condition, trying to measure that wetland condition. As pollution control, we use it heavily, not necessarily the rapid version, but our full version in our ambient status and trends monitoring, which we'll be talking about later in the afternoon. But I can see roles in it for mitigation sequencing, making a decision whether to, avoid impacts, to minimize that whole sequencing. Measuring restoration success or mitigation performance standards. I think it's already been applied in some ways, doing that with some folks. I'm seeing some nods out there. Maybe you guys at the end can chime in with that. I think there's more work to be done with that, but I think there's some promise there that could be used in that way. Local regional planning. I know like Blue Earth County, when they did their, WACA wetland plan, they have to do the inventory work for that. They, Paul Backenstead did a pretty broad application of Rapid FQA for that. Preservation screening, which was the original use of FQA, and even problem investigation. So, the next sequence of slides, we're going to be going through the Rapid FQA Manual. So I've created a manual that does the step-by-step for this that we usually do the training from. So you are more than welcome to open up your phone and follow along the manual if you choose so. So what did I say? like MPCA, yep, Floristic Quality Assessment. Search on that. Hopefully we got good signal. So you'll go to the MPCA Floristic Quality Assessment webpage. There's this picture of this really cool guy out there doing wetland work. It's awesome. If you scroll down, you'll see this Rapid Floristic Quality Assessment Manual. So like the next, I don't know, 20 minutes, we're going to be going through like different sections of this manual. And starting with section 2, I think. Blah, 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 introduction. There we go, yeah, 2.1. So feel free to work with your phone. It's probably the only time you've ever had a presenter say, yeah, please futz around with your phone. We'll get back to this. So I'm just going to go through a few I call them key concepts, components. Some are really obvious, some maybe not as obvious. But I think all crucial to kind of being able to apply this thing. The first is the defining your site or assessment area. This may seem really obvious and basic, but sometimes it kind of needs to be spelled out. And basically all we're talking about is your first step is you really have to define, what your site is, the wetland area that you're trying to represent with your vegetation sample. With FQA, flexibility is key. It's everything. It can be anything. It can be a wetland basin like this example here. If I have my pointer, I thought I had a pointer here. Change my display settings. Oh, come on now. There we go. There, I got my pointer back. It could be a wetland basin like this, nice blue outline. That's pretty handy. It can be a part of a wetland. It can be some handy boundary. It can be totally arbitrary. But the point is that you really need to define your boundary because we're going to be doing some mapping later on. All right, so here's an example of kind of an arbitrary boundary where we just kind of cut it off wherever because that wetland extends for miles and miles. You can make a small site, you can make a huge site. Plant communities are very important. Why are plant communities important? Well, because FQA metrics, well actually, the species composition and abundance distribution of different plant communities are fundamentally different from each other, and that's typically reflected in, it's going to be reflected in your FQA metrics. So each plant community will have different natural ranges, as well as it can have different response ranges. So this graph up here has a bunch of different agrocery plant communities. These blue boxes are distributions of metric scores from minimally impacted sites of that community type, and the red ones are distributions from severely impacted sites for those community types. So let's look at the extremes. How about floodplain forest, right? What kind of environment is it? Is there a lot of disturbance or not much disturbance in floodplain forest? A lot. Floods. It's floodplain forest. So all the species that typically inhabit that environment are adapted to a lot of disturbance. They tend to have really low C values. So a good score, this happens to be the weighted C metric, which we'll talk a little bit more later, might be a 3 or a 4 for a floodplain forest, and a bad one might be closer to 2. Well, what about a bog? What's going on in bogs? What kind of environment is a bog? Is it dynamic or is it really stable?
Pretty stable.
Extremely stable. So stable that we have these mosses in there that are shooting out acid. Really harsh environment, really specialized environment. And once it gets to that point, it tends to stay in that way, and the species that are there have high conservatism. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Are your weighted Cs including tree cover?
Yes, they are.
So does, yeah, so that includes all the different layers and coverages of
Yeah.
the trees,
Yeah. Yeah, we can talk about that more in a sec. But, you know, so would a score of 3.5 be good in a bog? No, it's, in fact, it's, at least from what we've measured, it's like off the chart. So that's why communities are important. So it means you have to what? You have to collect your data by community type, right? So each community within a site will have its own little set of data where you're collecting species information. And so for Rapid FQA, we basically follow Agris and Reed with some modification. We combine the strict Agris and Reed fresh wet meadow and sedge meadow into one single class, just called fresh meadow, because they're really environmental, or the native types aren't, there's really no difference. We're now working with seasonally flooded basin. I don't know if we ever will. That's a really ephemeral type of community. And then we have this sedge mat community, which is really equivalent to DNR's rich fen type of idea. So communities are really important. So when you get set up, you're going to be mapping communities within your site, and you're going to be collecting data by communities in your site. The rapid species list, the next key component. So this is where some of the innovative, I guess, sampling method comes up. Is said, well, can we kind of simplify things and you know, bring down the level, and we're going to do it by simplifying our plant species list, so we can bring down this level of expertise. And it also takes, you know, it takes a lot of time to ID tough species. So we're focused on the more common, dominant, easier to ID species. We boiled it down to 290 species. And when you're out there, you only look at the rapid species. You only need to look at those, and you can ignore everything else. So how did we choose this list? Well, it's all based off a very simple idea. Some plants are easier to ID than others. Let's have some fun. Let's have a little exercise. So this common wetland form, can anybody tell me what this is? Jewelweed, easy one, right? What about that common wetland form? Bed straw? Which one? There's two of them. There's Triphytum and Tinctorium that look basically the same unless you have the flower. So, you know, one is harder than the other. How about shrubs? Oh, this one? Okay, good. How about the one on the right? It's tough. I'm trying to mess with you guys. You can at least get to a group.
yeah.
It's a willow. Tea tree willow. There's all kinds of willows. Willows are tough. Finally, big nasty grass. It's not that big, but it's nasty. Come on, Reed, can hear your grass.
Yeah.
And then some sedge. Okay. So yeah, I think everybody kind of gets this idea. Some are easier than others. So we kind of just broke it down into, you know, this kind of 3 dimensions or 3 factors of what might go into making a plant harder to ID than a different plant. And I think it relates to how common it might be, how distinct looking it might be, and whether or not it's dominant. So if you just do a simple rating system like this with some criteria, you know, you can come up with kind of a way to systematically rate plants based on how easy they are to ID on a 1 to 6 scale. Ones are really common, they're unique looking, and they can be dominant. And the hard ones are rare species, not unique looking, and not dominant. And so we did these ratings, me and a couple other folks, with all of our wetland plant list. And I think we took, what was the cutoff? It was like a cutoff of 3. I think if it was 3 or less, we said it makes the list. And so that's how we got to our 290. And that 290 covers all those different plant communities, even calcareous fen. So we even have some calcareous fen species. All right, the data form. I actually have some handouts. So I only made 20 of these, so share. So the hallmark of any good RAM is like a really easy to use data form, right? Hopefully. So we try to make it so it's just one front back sheet of paper, and you can put 3 communities worth of data on that. And so the way it's organized is, you got your basic header information. You number your communities in here. Let's say you go to a site and you say there's fresh meadow here. You can throw it into the number 1 slot. And now if you have a species in fresh meadow, all you have to, if you see it when you're doing your survey, you just put a circle by the number 1 space for that species. Like, hey, I found alder in my fresh meadow. I'll put a little circle here. And then you use a circle because at the end we're going to be doing cover classes. And then you just write the number of the cover class in that circle. Pretty easy, huh? So front, back, and it's organized by the stratums, core stratums. And we even started using, I think the last time I revised this thing in 2014, we used the core nomenclature. But we are using scientific names, so you got to up your game a little bit. Okay, seasonal sampling period. When we were developing this thing, we did some repeat testing at a handful of sites every month from like March through October or something like that. And then you can run the calculations and see where it kind of stabilizes. And it's pretty stable generally between June and September. So that's when you can use this thing. Obviously it makes sense. If it's too early in the growing season, you can't ID a lot of stuff. It's hard to make cover class estimations that are really true because things are just starting. Likewise, at the end of the season, things are SNES. Time meander sampling. This is the other big piece of the rapid part. So, sampling for this, we don't need any plots. We don't need any transects. That stuff takes too much time, right? We gotta be fast. So basically all we're doing is walking around the site. We're trying to take kind of a representative path around the site. And we have some very simple timing rules to try to help equal out your effort. Again, we're only concerned with recording the species on your checklist. I mean, you can record other stuff if you want, but don't include them in your calculations. Single meander covers all communities in the site. Your total time, so you're going to have a base time and additional time periods. That's going to be based on the complexity of the site. So the rule is, for the first community at your site is 30 minutes. So you're on the hook for 30 minutes walking around. And each additional community add 20 more minutes to your walk. And then at the end, I'll show you an example. At the end, if you keep running into more species on your list at the end of your walk, you add another 10-minute time period and you keep going until you kind of don't see any new stuff. And then at the end, you're going to make cover class estimations for each species you see in each community. We'll have an example of this too, that should hopefully kind of clarify things. But you're probably saying, Mike, like, I can't walk out in the water. I only wear knee boots. I'm not going up there. So we said, okay, so when you have an open water type of situation, you can just go to 3 representative spots along the shoreline and just record the species that you kind of see right there, and then the species that you get from the rake toss. That's what those 3 arrows are. So I have this really high-tech rake. It's a hand cultivator. You bend the lines back, tie a 20-foot piece of rope to it, make 3 tosses out, retrieve it, like Beth is doing here. And then you get these big gobs of things, and see what's up there without having to get super deep. So let's talk about metrics a little bit. I'll try to stick to my time here. So I mentioned earlier that we've been looking at this weighted coefficient of conservatism metric, this weighted C. And when we say weighted, it's weighted by cover, weighted by abundance. And again, there's a lot of metrics out there. The classic ones are, native species richness, and you just take a mean C, just take the average of the species, C values that you see out there without considering the abundance. And then the FQI, which is square root of native species times the mean C. Those are like the core metrics or whatever. This is like a step beyond that. And so how do you calculate WC? It's just the summation. You guys remember summation sign, right? Math, it's a long time ago, I bet, for some of you. Of the proportional abundance of each species times its C value. So over here we have a hypothetical, extremely simplified set of data for a fresh meadow. Now we got blue joint grass and characteristic. Those are kind of our dominant codominants. They got cover classes of 4 and 5. Cover class 5 is like 50 to 75%. And we just take the midpoint of those cover classes. That's what this column is here. So these are all the data for that. Now if you divide the midpoint by the total cover, the total midpoint, you come up with this value P. That's its proportional cover, or relative cover. I'll get my pointer back here. Now that, you're just multiplying that number by its C value. That's all that PC is. You come up with that number, and then you just sum it all. And that's how you get your weighted C. Piece of cake, right? So obviously it takes, you're incorporating more information into that. Now why are we using weighted C instead of those simple presence-absence metrics? Turns out that it's way better performer as an indicator. It does a way better job. So what we have here is 4 different graphs of the same data from hardwood swamps, our hardwood swamp data set. And again, the blue boxes are the distribution for minimally impacted sites, which we have 60 of. And severely impacted sites is the red one, which we have only 10, but it's something. And so here's our native species richness. So what you want to see to make a good indicator is you want to see clear separation between these two ends. If they're not separating, if they're like completely overlapping, that metric has 0 value as an indicator. Jason?
How many sites are you comparing here?
Yeah, so in the blue box contains 60 sites. That mostly came from DNR Relevant data. And only able to get to 10